Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to MLS Live Ask a Scientist. In just a few moments, we are going to meet our educators who will be answering all of your questions about human evolution. My name is Christina. I'll be serving as your moderator today, and even though you can see my face right now, you'll mostly be hearing my voice in the background as I share your questions and observations with our educators. If you are watching us on Zoom today and would like to ask a question, you can do so by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And don't forget to include your name and age if you would like a shout out. Also, if you need captions today, you can do so by selecting the show captions on closed captions at the bottom of your screen. If you happen to be watching on YouTube or Facebook today, unfortunately, we'll not be able to see your comments, but we're so happy that you're joining us and we hope you enjoy the program. But with all of that being said, I would like to invite our educators to turn on their cameras, introduce themselves, and they're going to be sharing what their specialties are related to human evolution.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan, and human evolution is one of my all-time favorite subjects to talk about, and can talk about a wide range of stuff. But in particular, I love talking about early human migrations, as well as Neanderthals and some of the similarities and differences between them and modern humans.
I'm Mike, and my background is in archaeology, so I love talking about the archaeological evidence for human evolution and how tools have changed over time, which species develop tools, how old they are, as well as what kinds of tools they used and how they differ from species to species.
Hi, everyone. My name is Susan. My pronouns are she, her. And my background is in molecular biology, but I had a really great teacher tell me a lot about human evolution. And so it's always been kind of just a fun interest of mine that I've always followed. So I have kind of a broad general knowledge over a lot of the past 6 million years of human evolution.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your introductions. And I'll remind everyone that if you want to ask a question about those specialties or any other topic related to human evolution, don't forget to include that in the Q&A. But to get us started, I was wondering if you all maybe could talk a little bit about what would you have to study to really even begin to understand human evolution and basically our history and ancestry.
That's a great question to start with because as Susan kind of mentioned in her introduction, you can get into anthropology in a wide variety of different ways. My background is actually in cultural anthropology, so I like to, in school I was studying modern human populations, but I also got an undergraduate in evolutionary biology, and some of the most interesting evolution I found was our own species and where we came from. So, and that helped me a lot when I first started in anthropology in graduate school and looking at sort of physical anthropology, the evolution of humans in general, using those same sorts of biological principles and applying them to our own species helped me to understand a lot about where and when different species might have emerged in sort of this human lineage. But I think Mike is going to give a very different answer because you can also study a very different side of human evolution in archaeology.
Yeah, I would say that, from the archaeology standpoint, there's a lot of experimental archaeology that's happening around human evolution. And in fact, I think I've got a picture. I'll just make it my background. So I'm kind of spearing myself in the head here, but there you see myself holding an atlatl spear thrower. It's an ancient spear throwing device. And what you see there is basically a 6 foot long spear or arrow that you can use to hunt various large animals. And different peoples around the world, modern humans, developed this technology 30,000 years ago, and people are still learning just how it worked, how effective it was, and they come up with some great experiments to test the power and accuracy of tools like this. So one can learn just by trying to replicate the past and the tools that they used and actually using them, which is pretty exciting.
So I'll mention just a couple of other areas, like different avenues to get into human evolution as well. Geology is incredibly important because you want to be able to date the fossils or the bones or the tools that you find. So understanding a lot about rocks. can be really important as well. Being able to, from a molecular biology standpoint, just in the past maybe decade or so, we've been able to get DNA and protein evidence from our slightly more recent relatives, so Neanderthals and those that lived maybe in the past 100,000 years or so. And so you can use genetic DNA and protein information to learn more about these as well. So there's many different sciences that you can use to get into the anthropology. Personally, I like the stories behind it. It's a great story of how one thing turned into another thing, or how it's not turned into, how one thing evolved and slowly over time evolved into something else, but then we get new information and the story changes. So I really like the story aspect behind human evolution.
Awesome. That's a fascinating. Thank you, everyone. And our next question comes from Zane from Maine, age 8, has a mouthful for me, who would like to know, what is your favorite tool you have discovered? And maybe if you didn't personally discover it, maybe you can talk about a favorite tool that has some significance to human evolution.
Well, I mentioned my background is in archaeology. I wasn't excavating anywhere where we found early human tools, but I did excavate at a site in Italy where there were lots of Roman tools, including a really interesting cheese grater. So it looked a lot like a cheese grater that you might use for shredding Parmesan cheese on your pasta, except it was made of bronze, so a different metal than we use today, steel or stainless steel. And bronze sort of turns like a bluish green kind of color, almost like the color of our background here. So we discovered in this dirt this beautiful colored metal object, and you could see all the little holes for grading. I've done some work here in the States as well, and that includes finding various projectile points. You may have heard of them as arrowheads, but they could be arrowheads or spear points. So those are made of stone, and they preserve very, very well. In fact, they're stone tools that date to millions of years. These were just a few hundred years also.
Yeah, I myself have not discovered any tools, but I did get to do a really cool experiment when I was in graduate school, because I had a friend who was studying the expertise in stone tool use in ancient humans. And so they were interested in seeing if we could determine whether there were different people learning how to use stone tools when they were carving on bone. And so in order to test that, they had to do a lot of different tests with people using knives in modern day culture, and then inexperienced people like myself using stone tools to cut meat off of bone. And so I got to spend an afternoon using stone tools to cut meat off of some ribs, which was incredibly difficult, but also very, very fun to do.
So again, I haven't discovered any stone tools, but one of the really cool moments that I had many years ago when I was in college, I visited London and the British Museum there. And one of the coolest things that I saw, and this was before I was really even into learning much about human evolution, one of the coolest things I saw was one of the oldest man-made objects in the entire world. And it was a stone chopping tool. And if we saw one on the ground, we might just think a regular rock, but Mike and Jonathan could definitely tell the difference. It's about, this big, and it has a sharp edge on it. And it was dated to about 2 million years ago. And it was the oldest man-made thing I had ever seen and still have ever seen. There's a few tools that we think are a little bit older, even like 3 million years, but this 2 million year old tool was at the time the oldest man-made object ever. And it was just really cool to be able to see it, that it was made by humans, but 2 million years ago.
Those are all fascinating. I definitely would just pick up a rock and not know the difference. So I'm glad we have folks like you around. And for our next question, it comes from Isora, 9 years old, who would like to know, how does evolution happen?
That's a great question. And when it comes to humans, it's something that we're still figuring out what sort of things actually drove human evolution and what was important. In general, evolution occurs because there is struggle for survival. So there are limited food resources or limited access to habitat, and individuals within a species or populations of different species have to compete for those limited resources. And so those that have particular advantages tend to survive better, produce more offspring, and as a result, they spread their genetics to the next generation, and those advantageous adaptations that they have sort of spread wider and wider across a population. And over time, those changes become so extreme that we say they've speciated, they've become a new species. So in the case of humans, what probably drove a lot of our early evolution has to do with climate change, that we're descended from the same line as great apes, right? So we were originally tree-dwelling ancestors we had, and we started to sort of come down out of the trees because in Africa, roughly 6.5 to 7 million years ago, it was going through a warming period, and a lot of what was traditionally rainforest was becoming more sort of open savanna grassland. And so that's where the food resources were for us to potentially exploit and survive on. And so that benefited potentially a species that could stand up on 2 legs, that could use tools. And then, obviously there are a lot of other things that contributed over the course of the next 7 million years to turn us into modern humans. But it was sort of that drive to find a space, right? And an ecological niche is what it's called, someplace with the right sort of food and habitat for us to survive in.
And the things that humans eventually had to make them better able to compete, I'll just throw in the little molecular biology, those are just tiny little changes happen in all living organisms' DNA over time. A little change here, a little change there that maybe makes your muscles build a little stronger, maybe makes you a little shorter or a little taller. And they're random. They happen randomly over time. And all those selective pressures that Jonathan talked about, basically the ones that the mutations where they're better adapted to do X, Y, or Z, those are the ones that get passed on. So it's a lot of randomness in our own DNA and genetic material, and then a lot of how best to survive that shows which one is going to succeed, pass it on. And it's something that happens very, very slowly over a very long, over tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years.
That is very interesting. And I think it ties nicely to our next question, because Alex from Texas, he would like to know, have you ever studied Mayan or Meso-American human evolution? And I would add to that, do people evolve differently in these different regions?
So I'll start a little bit with this just to continue kind of what I was just saying, is that human evolution takes thousands and thousands of years. And the Mayan civilization and Meso-American, so Inca, Aztec, if you're talking about all those were just a few hundred years ago. That was not long ago at all. So the humans that lived, the Mayans, the Aztec, the Incas, they are essentially identical for human evolution purposes, identical to all of us here today. There's really no difference in change. There's going to be as much differences between my hair color and Jonathan's hair color, or my height and Mike's height. But overall, we're virtually identical. We're the same species as they were. But we could, I don't know if anyone wants to talk a little bit about the Mayan culture. We had a great Mayan exhibit a few years ago, but that's a cultural difference and not an evolution difference.
Yeah, I would, second everything that Susan said, and thinking about modern humans and cultures and societies across the world, most of them can be grouped into cultures that farm. So if you think about sort of 8,000 years ago, when farming started to develop, that was a big shift in how humans got their food. So you'd have sort of hunter-gatherer societies before that. And there still are some isolated hunter-gatherer populations, indigenous populations throughout the world. For example, in Africa, in the Kalahari, in Australia, Aboriginal peoples there. But most people worldwide are farming, and that changes, dramatically, the social structures that you have, and the size of groups. So when we think about early humans, we think about small groups, sort of family sort of structures, and they would sort of help each other out and survive as a small population. But once you start, being able to farm, then, your communities can get bigger and bigger and bigger. And with that comes things like rulers, kings and queens, and people to sort of, bureaucracy, really, to kind of take care of everybody, and priests in different classes. So you don't see that until sort of the beginning of farming. It's not so much a change in our bodies, but in a change in how we get food and how it changes our culture.
Perfect. And for our next question, it comes from Susan, who would like to know which species is now thought to be our earliest ancestor.
That's a good question, and a fairly complicated question because it depends on what you mean by earliest ancestor. We can trace, obviously, human lineage all the way back to the origin of life if we wanted to, right? Probably more specifically, you're thinking about hominins, which are the group of organisms that belong specifically to the line that became modern humans. So again, I mentioned earlier, we came from great apes. About 7 million years ago, a line split off from the rest of the great apes that would eventually become modern Homo sapiens. That split occurred roughly 7 million years ago. So that, and we know that because we've discovered a fossil that is 6.5 to 7 million years old. And then there is the evolution of modern humans ourselves. So, and the emergence of modern humans. And that is a huge debate about when that may have occurred based on a number of different factors. But generally, it's considered to be anywhere between 150 to 300,000 years ago is when the first Homo sapiens began to sort of walk the earth and make their own place.
And just because you use that terminology, Jonathan, Homo sapiens, that's actually related to Nolan's question, who would like to know, are we Homo sapiens?
Yeah, and I can just keep going because this is some of my favorite stuff to talk about. So yeah, when we say Homo sapiens, what we're referring to is sort of a taxonomic classification. So you may have heard of kingdom, phylum, group, order, class, family, genus, species is how we sort of organize all life. And when we say Homo sapiens, that is the genus and the species. So there are other organisms that have been in the genus Homo, meaning similar. So there are potential other species, Neanderthals being a big one there. We have Homo naledi was a huge discovery a few years ago that is another potential species within our group. We are the only species that currently exists within that genus. And sapiens is another interesting question and depends on just how strict you're being about what a Homo sapiens is. So it could be that there are several subspecies of us, or could have been in evolutionary time, I should say. And so some anthropologists actually label us now Homo sapiens sapiens, indicating that we are the sapiens subspecies of the Homo sapiens species. So it gets very, very complicated depending on how you look at it. But yes, we as modern humans, to one extent or another, are Homo sapiens.
And I'll just add to that. I knew that's exactly where you were going. And just to when Jonathan was starting to talk about the different subspecies. So for example, Neanderthals, some people might consider also Homo sapiens, but Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. So they're a subspecies of Homo sapiens. So they're not exactly the same species of us, but a different subspecies. Same species, different subspecies, something like that. So that's if you've heard of the Hobbit, the Hobbit in anthropology terms, Homo floresiensis, some people might consider that maybe Homo sapiens floresiensis. So gets a little confusing, but Neanderthals is probably the best example for that.
And these categorizations change over time, as all do in science. As we learn more information, we classify objects in different groups. So, part of the reasons that it's changing is the evidence is changing as we get more fossils, more complete fossils, as we excavate them from under the ground. There's also DNA studies as well. So from some fossils that are more recent, you could actually collect DNA and compare that DNA across populations. So that's one of the reasons we know that modern humans actually have some Neanderthal DNA in our genome, which is pretty amazing. And they found that by looking at Neanderthal DNA that they recovered from fossils. And that was, these techniques are evolving and changing as we speak, as scientists get better at getting those little tiny clues and bits of information from the tiny bit of evidence that they have. So we'll certainly learn more and have a better understanding in years to come.
It's fascinating to hear all the different classifications. And I have kind of a two-parter here related to that. One is, so when we talk about cavemen, what classification is that? And also, speaking on cavemen, Quinn, age 10, would like to know if they hunted mammoths and saber-toothed tigers.
That's another great question. So caveman is another one of those terms that really doesn't have a scientific basis. So it could apply to a number of different species or potential species within Homo. Generally, it refers to archaic humans who largely lived in caves, though, in order to find shelter. So most well-known would be modern humans, Denisovans, which are a recent population that also probably were cave dwellers, and then Neanderthals were sort of the original cave dwellers. A lot of their early discoveries and even discoveries today are found in caves where they were habitating. I don't know if it would be accurate to say they were hunting saber-toothed cats so much as they were probably hunted by saber-toothed cats. They almost certainly were hunting mammoths. There were also giant cave bears. The habitat and fauna of early Europe was very, very different from today because it was during an ice age. You had a lot of large animals in the area. And Neanderthals in particular were very good at cooperative hunting. They had very complex hunting weapons, as Mike mentioned earlier. So they could absolutely hunt some of that big game. They were also probably fairly vulnerable to predators themselves, which is why they were huddled up in caves.
And some of the evidence for what these peoples hunted actually comes from the caves themselves and cave art. So, starting back as 40,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago throughout Europe, there are cave paintings where you can actually see, our human ancestors, painted different animals, including mammoths and large woolly rhinoceroses and things that don't exist anymore. So that's one line of evidence, is the art. From the archaeological evidence and the tools, they have found some of those projectile points, those spear points that I mentioned, in association with mammoth bones. So actually, Jonathan mentioned before, sort of looking at the wear on bones and that study that he did. So under a microscope, you can tell, whether a bone has been gnawed on by a predator like a smilodon or a saber-toothed cat or anything really, or whether it was made by a human tool. So they've done that analysis as well. And then also there's evidence of those early humans using mammoth bones for shelters. So actually building sort of structures with them. So imagine sort of this domed kind of structure built out of the bones and ribs that would have been covered with hides or fur to sort of keep it warm. So there's various lines of evidence for what they have.
And I think that's a fascinating note about art, Mike, because we have kind of a couple of questions thinking about first for humans, specifically like first time or why people started walking on 2 feet, talking, or even having culture as represented through things like art.
So, that's an excellent question. Yeah, I'll let Susan handle it first.
Sorry. So one of the things about walking upright is really fascinating. And Jonathan started to talk a little bit about it before, is that we came down from the trees because the food was down below, the landscape had changed. And maybe there were long grasses. We're not really sure which came first, kind of the walking upright or tool use, but they would have come together. Walking upright meant that they had their hands free. And if they had their hands free, well, they would have been better able to hold a tool. And they would have wanted a tool because as they started to walk upright, their sharp teeth started to get smaller. So again, did the tool use come first and then the teeth got shorter? Did the teeth get shorter so they had to have tool use? And then the more we started walking upright as well around this time, our brains started getting bigger. And so humans are a rarity in the animal kingdom in that babies are completely helpless. You've got, a newborn dog, horse, cow, if you ever seen, they can walk right away or with it very, very shortly. Humans take a whole year before we can walk and take care of ourselves or to feed ourselves or anything. So humans had to start carrying them. So in order to carry them, you need to walk on two legs. So again, all of these things, we're not sure what those selective pressures that happened first, but we've got walking upright, we've got carrying babies, we've got being able to use a tool, we've got our teeth getting shorter. All of these things were really happening right around the same time. Again, those selective pressures, something like climate change happening and needing to come down out of the trees. But so a lot of those firsts came along working together. If someone's holding a baby and cooking food at the same time, well, then they're not going to be able to go out and hunt. And so they're going to need to be taken care of by other people. You're going to need to share responsibilities of things. So we start getting people working together. So that's the start of culture also happening in there. So that's kind of a lot of things happening all within a one kind of time period.
I was going to say the art that we do see shows what may have been important to these people. So I mentioned the cave art before, and the hunt obviously is something that they would need to survive, to have that meat, to have that food. Also, there's great evidence to what they cared for in the graves that they created. So starting about 75,000 years ago or so, you start to see burials with jewelry. So that jewelry that would have been made using the tools that Susan described. As the tools get finer, you can manipulate finer materials. So, those first stone tools were really just, sort of lava cobbles that were flakes, just sharp bits of stone that you could use for things. But they were using very fine tools at that point, about 75,000 years ago, to create small holes in shells. So you can create things like necklaces and bracelets. And you find those in various graves of humans, Homo sapiens. But also Neanderthals, may have buried their dead as well. There's some evidence for that. And although we don't find those same sorts of grave goods, you do find things like coloring around the graves. So ochre, which is a natural pigment that's used to make sort of a reddish orange kind of paint or coloring, often decorates Neanderthal burials. So that might have been some sort of sign of culture. And then you have things like figurines that they would have been making out of bone, shell, more. One of my favorites, since you asked about sort of specifics, is a bone with some scratches in it that anthropologists, those who study peoples in the past, have interpreted as sort of an observation of the moon. So you actually see the moon go through phases or changes over time. And on this bone are sort of scrawlings that look like the phases of the moon from a crescent to a full moon, which is amazing. And that dates to tens of thousands of years ago. So it shows that ancient peoples, just like peoples today, had diverse interests, and they were observing the world around them and trying to make connections to that world in various ways, and the art reflects that.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for having such thorough answers. I was just looking at the time and realized that we are out of it. So I want to thank Jonathan and Mike and Susan for your wonderful knowledge sharing today. Thank you. And you can say goodbye to our audience.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day.
And I want to thank our audience today for joining our program. If you asked a question and we didn't have enough time to get to it, I am sorry about that. But what I will say is that we are going to have more programs like this week and in the future. So if you'd like to have a chance to see what other programs we're offering and what kinds of questions you might be able to ask, you can check out all of our offerings on our website at mos.org/mosathome. And also, if you enjoyed this program today and would like to learn how you can help support programs like this and the Museum of Science, you can visit our website at engage.mos.org/welcome. Thank you all so much for joining. We hope you had a good time, and we'll catch you at the next one.